America in Washington, D.C., also Vice President at ORF. It is really a pleasure to, and I should add, for the benefit of our Raisina Young Fellows, I'm an alumnus of the what was then called the Asian Forum for Global Governance, now rebranded the Raisina Young Fellows program from 2016, and so I'm dating myself a little bit here, 10 years ago. But it's a really fun, real pleasure to be here to moderate this panel with all of you. I know you've all had a long day, so we're going to try and make this exciting and make this interesting. We have a really stellar panel here to talk about the future of the international order, and I really want to keep this future-oriented. I will just briefly introduce them, but their bios are available. Florence Gaub from the National Defense College in Rome, Alexander Dinkin, who's the president of the Primakov Institute in Moscow, Hans Christian Hagman with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden, former Deputy National Security Advisor, Amrita Narlikar, who is a distinguished fellow at ORF, and Karim Hagar, who is from Egypt originally, but is now the head of SIPRI, very prestigious think tank based in Stockholm, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I'm going to start with, instead of all of us giving speeches, a quick question to all of you. All of you work in different ways in think tanks or in research institutes or doing research for the government. How do you all envision the international order in 10 years' time? So if in a minute each, you can just give looking ahead, what do you see as the key features of the international? We talk about the international order in very vague terms. You've heard a lot about this over the past 24 hours. Maybe a few specifics. So maybe start with Florence.
Yes, thank you. Okay, just a minute. That's pretty brief. I'll tell you first what NATO, where I work, expects, but then maybe also what I expect. As you can imagine, NATO expects, but that's also by design and always has been more or less that way. NATO expects the future to be bleak because we are a defensive organization, so we always think about what could go wrong and undermine it. As you know, NATO is increasing defense spending, is preparing for a world that is more hostile and where we have to defend ourselves. So that's what NATO thinks as a whole. What I think is that when we look at the more sophisticated trends, we see we have more conflicts in the world, that's true, but they're less lethal. That's something that people are not talking about enough, that yes, we have more conflicts, but people are dying less in wars than they used to. So I think that's a positive thing, but we haven't quite understood it. I do not foresee a world without wars or conflicts, but I do see something else happening, that the nature of war is changing, hopefully in a way that is beneficial, especially to casualties, human rights, and so forth in terms of conflict. But 10 to 20 years from now, I think I do not, unfortunately, see immediately détente, which doesn't mean it won't happen, but at least the mindset in NATO is we're going to prepare for the worst case.
Thank you.
Well, if we were asked this question in 2016 about 2026, I guess people would laugh about our answers. So my take is that the composition of the great powers would be approximately the same. Maybe you are familiar, you are from Washington, that in non-published but leaked part of national security strategy, there are suggestions that there would be 5 great powers: United States, China, India, Russia, and Japan. And the strange point that there is no one of the big 3 from Europe. This is the biggest question for me for 2026, but I would not like to speculate on this matter.
Hans Christian?
Well, let's do a bit of imagination here. It's a more polarized world. Europe is entirely dependent on Chinese green tech in order for its own survival and management of climate change. Europe is more autonomous and has succeeded in that. China has not yet invaded Taiwan, and there's a degree of stability between the United States and China. It is a more stovepiped world, which means that everything is more expensive. It's low growth and relative high inflation all across the board. We have climate vulnerability, not least in South Asia and large parts of Africa, holding these 2 huge areas back. Russia, thank you, has been part of, or has enjoyed 3 democratic elections and is returning to the fold as a strong economy, a European country with a bright future. And Belarus has just applied for EU membership. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was a little bit of scaremongering at the start, Hans. So I'll give a very optimistic scenario. Okay. So first and foremost, there is no more siloization between trade and security. Right? People have taken that lesson, that interdependence can be weaponized. So none of that sweet we'll talk more, we'll talk to each other, we'll trade with each other, and therefore we will all come to love each other. So integration will not, that there is recognition. Okay, so the World Trade Organization exists, but it doesn't deal only with trade anymore. It takes national security concerns into account. The second lesson that's been taken from all the difficulties, the challenges, the upheaval that we're going through right now, is that ideas from the global south matter, right? And it's not just tokenism. It's not just about giving them a seat at the table, although it is about giving them a seat at the table too in the UN Security Council. But ideas matter. For example, coming from India, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the entire earth is one family. Not all the peoples of the earth are one family. All beings of this earth are one family. And then my third and final point, globalization has changed. And there is still globalization, but it's a globalization that's managing trade-offs between prosperity, security, and also compassion and deep ecology. So that's my scenario for 10 years from now.
Thank you. Karim, please. It wasn't all optimistic, you know.
So any conception of global order rests on three pillars. Power configurations, how power is distributed in any given system, institutional frameworks and how those are shaped and what they look like, and normative foundations, the ideas, right? Not just the ideas, but also legal frameworks. All of these three pillars are either, depending on your description, either are crumbling or are in flux. So to answer your very ambitious question about what all of this looks like 10 years from now, I have no idea. But I think it may be, as we go along in this conversation, it may be interesting to unpack the drivers affecting each of these pillars. So clearly the balance of power is shifting. We have a number of rising powers challenging the existing, or what was used to be referred to as the Western dominated order. We have a fraying of institutions. Many of the issues that were governed by multilateral frameworks are now decided outside of those frameworks and increasingly being weaponized. So finance, trade, critical technologies, critical minerals. And of course, the normative foundation is shifting quite radically. We've heard throughout these 2 days at Raisina, the erosion of international law, international norms. So how these three pillars will be decided, I think will take us to the 10-year projection that you mentioned.
Okay, I have a quick follow-up for each of you based on what you said in your answer. So let's start again with Florence. You said the wars are becoming less lethal. And I think that would be a surprise to a lot of people who are reading the news. It's true that the two most lethal conflicts, I think, in the past 30 years were ones that we don't pay as much attention to, which was in Congo and in Syria. But barring that, why do you think wars are becoming less lethal? Is it simply a function of precision-guided technologies, targeted strikes? Is it because civilians are even more readily taken out of war zones? What makes you so confident that that's the case?
I'm not sure I'm confident about the answer. Well, the data is clear. So in terms of lethality, you know, the way it's calculated it sounds a bit cynical, so forgive me, but it's calculated by the size of the population and then how many people die in that conflict. And so, yes, because we are also, well, when you read the news, it doesn't give you those numbers, but we're also more people today. So when on the planet, when you look at the total numbers, you will not get the impression that it's less lethal, but it is. So a combination of the factors that you already touched on. One possibly is precision-guided weapons, so that you really more targeted, which is the weapons themselves, but it's also, of course, intelligence material. So when you have high resolution intelligence material, you know you're going to strike exactly that. That's going to be easier than if you're kind of shooting in the dark and you're just going to, you know, break a lot of stuff in the attempt. So it's a combination of equipment, but also intelligence material. It also has to do with migration or asylum seeking. So people now can flee, or they do flee more easily a conflict zone. Is that because also thanks to the internet, it's easier also for communities to connect? You know, we know that when you have a group of refugees in one country, then people are more likely to go there. So it could be the creation of, let's say, refugee communities, also thanks to the internet, but also thanks to the much higher visibility, I will say, of that. And then hopefully, but for that, unfortunately, I have no evidence, but you would hope that military institutions to pay more attention to the protection of human rights. That I do not have significant data that proves that. I know that in some cases, for instance, NATO's Libya operation, there was a really painstakingly tedious process to be sure that every single target was approved multiple times to make sure that people aren't dying. But that's not necessarily the case in every conflict. But I would hope that there is more sensitivity for the respect of human life also. So I would say it's a combination of the three.
Professor Dinke, what you mentioned, if we were to see a leaked version of the Russian national security strategy, what would the great powers be? What would be the great powers in a leaked version of the Russian national security strategy?
Well, it would be the same as in all security strategies. It would be United States and China, including the, let's say, second tier great power like Russia, India, and Japan. Regarding your question to Florence, I guess that important source of the wars in the past was the demise of empires. You look at British Empire, Ottoman Empire, or Yugoslavia, Soviet Union. If you look into the future, there is no more empires. So one source of conflicts would disappear. This is my guess.
Okay. Hans Christian, a question for you. You painted a very bleak economic picture, an era of low growth, high inflation, very dependence on imports. But you didn't. Maybe this makes it bleaker. You didn't. You kind of overlooked one other factor, which is demographics. And we are also seeing. I mean, one thing we can predict with, I think, a degree of certainty is the demographic future. Is that not going to cause deflation? I mean, might that actually also reverse some of the trends that you suggested?
Dhruva,
and you have to speak also closer. If I can ask all speakers to speak closer to the mic.
Certainly. Thank you, Dhruva. Of course, demographics is, we all love demographics. Demographics, education, infrastructure, these are long-term trends that we can predict with relative high degree. I would not see, and the case why I say that a low growth and a high inflation is that today's globalized world is super rational. So everything that is less rational, less efficient, becomes more expensive. If we are to do everything ourselves and not have specialization across the world, it will be more expensive. And we're also, as far as we can see, increasing our defense budgets, and also we need to invest in tomorrow's technologies and trends. So there is a lot of costs and a lot of needs, but perhaps not so much of the good stuff. But getting back to demographics, I think the key question is, can automation compensate for demographic decline? And I think that we're seeing in Japan, so far, they have not automated enough to compensate for the decline. The question is, will China? That is the really big question. And what will happen then if they do succeed in automation? What will you then do with a China with 200 to 300 million unemployed? Will that society thrive despite of this, or how will it develop? For me, that is one of the biggest
questions. We'll all
questions.
become content creators and influencers.
God bless them.
Amrita, I want to ask you about, you specialize in international trade and the WTO, and I was actually even surprised you brought up that the WTO would exist 10 years from now, because I'm not sure it will. But the international order was built with, like, as you suggested, these sort of parallel architectures of security, with the UN Security Council, NATO, Warsaw Pact, others, and then an economic architecture, IMF, World Bank, GATT, WTO, all of that. You suggested correctly, I think, that these are now bleeding together and we can't really have those silos anymore. What kind of institutions do you see? Will one of these institutions, like the ones I mentioned, the G20 perhaps, adapt to become more like that place where that blended architecture can be created, or will we have something new? So I just want you to creatively think.
Sure. That's not an easy question. I should mention, though, that there is a WTO ministerial coming at the end of this month, and I don't want to down the WTO just before they are going into the reform process. So on a more serious note, the WTO is indeed in trouble because it speaks about national security barely enters, right, in this discussion, except through one clause. And when they talk about security, it's actually in terms of security of supply as opposed to national security. Will it be the G20 or some such body that will be able to regulate this? I'm not very optimistic if they can. Right? This is very technical rules that deal with, for example, how do you deal rules of origin, and you can write treatises on this and still not be able to keep out certain products from your country because it is, and in this world of global supply chains, it's very complicated. So what could it look like? I think it's if the WTO is going to survive meaningfully, right? I don't think it's going to die, but if it's going to survive meaningfully and therefore address some of the geoeconomic problems that we're seeing today, it's going to have to reconsider some of the fundamental principles, including MFN, right? And that's not a conversation that we're going. I'll be very surprised if we have a conversation in the ministerial, but we need to be having this conversation. And then we get concentric circles, we get plurilaterals. We don't have that universal form of multilateralism anymore.
Karim, you had mentioned sort of three pillars of the international order: so power, institutions, and norms and law. In some ways, how much do you say like the institutions and norms and law are really dependent on the power dynamic? I mean, we were having a conversation earlier today about the origins of the United Nations, and it really came up because of that. This was the winning side of World War II, right? So, how much do you think we really need to go back to fundamentals and look at where the power dynamic lands before we even think about institutions and norms? Is that something that you think we should? Is that a useful way of thinking about the international order?
Yes, no, thank you, Dhruva. This is a very important question because it gets at a big theme in international relations scholarship in general, whether institutions can outlast changes in the balance of power. And this is a big question and needs a lot of unpacking. So I would pose two big questions as to how this overall trajectory would be decided. And I think that the first big question is the posture of the United States. So not to take too much of a US-centric focus on this, but it makes a huge difference when the biggest, greatest power in the global system takes itself out of the global order altogether, right? So this is maybe a variation on what President Stoop told us. You know, President Stoop told us the rupture, meaning the change of posture of the United States in the context of the Western alliance. No, I think this is broader than that. The United States, at least the current administration, has taken itself outside of the global order altogether. So it's saying openly, we are not bound by the rules of global trade, of global international law, of global alliance frameworks. We are outside of this. So that, I think, if that trajectory is maintained, the world order would look very different. The second big question is whether this contestation will be decided by great power conflict, so moving from the gray zone to open conflict between the great powers, or whether it will be decided by accommodation, so adapting the institutions to reflect the changing balance of power. So the UN Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, all of the institutions that Amrita talked about, whether that will be decided by some form of negotiated accommodation or will be decided by force, by great power conflict.
Last round, but I do want to make this conversational. I think one of the great things about the AFGG program is the ability for you all to interact with our speakers. So I'm just going to do one last round of questions, and we'll start getting your questions ready so that I can call on you. And if you could please introduce yourself when I call on you. I'm going to ask all of you about a regional issue, and it's not the regions you might think I will ask all of you about. Florence, starting with you. I know NATO thinks about a lot of issues, including its eastward, what's happening in Ukraine and Moldova and places like that. But one region we've not really talked about much, Africa. Right next to Europe, you're sitting in Rome, in the southern flank of Europe. You have periodic issues with refugees. You have Mediterranean. You have competition over resources in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean especially. Where do you see Africa with its huge demographic dividend playing a role in NATO and European security planning?
Yeah, I love that question because a year and a half ago, I went to the World Science Fiction Convention, and I managed even to convince my boss that I was doing it for research. And that's actually true, because you know why? Because science fiction is an expression of how much a society thinks about the future in creative terms. And one of the things I discovered that I found surprising was that you had huge African presence. So many African authors, and of course, you all know Wakanda, Black Panther, and all that. But actually, I think the Afrofuturism is something that, as Europeans, I wish we would learn from more, because there is the perception that if you don't have a good present, you can't imagine a good future. And so, actually, Africa is a good example that that's actually absolutely the case. So yes, it's a continent full of problems, and I don't want to deny them. I think Europeans tend to think of Africa as mainly a problem continent. Migration, climate change will hit it very hard, especially the Maghreb, competition with China and Russia over influence and so forth. But I am convinced, because you asked earlier, where do we see geopolitical order in 10 years? I think, well, maybe not in 10, but 20 years, maybe 30. We will look at Africa in a completely different way, in terms of innovation and tech, especially when it comes to climate tech, health and so forth. I see a lot of potential, but the space to perceive that is missing. So just because we're not looking doesn't mean it's not happening.
But how much is Africa future in
So in NATO thinking, it's completely absent, I would say, pretty much. We're really struggling. So yes, you're right. You have a strong tendency in NATO to look east. Because, well, for all the obvious reasons, but also traditionally, even during the Cold War, I saw afterwards a study that calculated what if the Soviet Union had attacked NATO from the south, and it would have been actually easier for the Soviet Union to win because all the focus of NATO at the time was on the east. So I would say that has not really changed that much. In that, even just looking at the southern flank in terms of, just the Arab states, we're really struggling to get attention for that. And then beyond the Sahel, I think it just peters out. So yes, you have still some struggle for attention, especially, the southern states, Italy, France, and so forth, fighting for it. But it is a real fight for attention for this, absolutely.
Professor Dinkin, I want to ask you a little bit about, again, another region we haven't touched upon, and perhaps we should talk about more in India, but Central Asia. And it's a place where, obviously connected historically and culturally to Russia, close to China, has cultural links with India as well. I think we have a Kazakh and maybe a few other Central Asian participants here. How do you see the future of Central Asia from Moscow?
Today, much better than before, because, there were also conflicts according very voluntaristic borders, which were designed, especially in the Fergana region. After President Mirziyoyev took office in Tashkent, the situation changed for the best. And today, those 5 countries, they try to organize more coordinated economic, foreign policy. And I guess that the problem of these countries, for example, for Uzbekistan, is the demography. 1 million new births annually. So they have no other choice than to export labor force. In particular, they start exporting labor force to Germany, organized export of labor force. But I guess that the future of those countries looks okay. We are cooperated with all of them, and the statistical figures over there are much better than for Russia.
So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a bright future, you think?
I think so, but if you compare statistics for the members and non-members, the difference is very, very easily visible.
Hans Christian, we don't have someone from East Asia on here, but it's a region you have spent a lot of time on and think about a lot. I thought you were quite sanguine when you said, oh, nothing's going to change on Taiwan in 10 years' time. Maybe a little bit, why are you so confident about that? And what does the East Asian architecture look like 10 years from now?
To start with, I think that we are underestimating technology and the impact that will have on geostrategy, geopolitics, and geoeconomics. And what really I'm both frightened by and impressed by the Chinese investments in high tech. It's AI, it's quantum, it's biomanufacturing, bioengineering, synthetic biology. It is very much within the traditional heavy industries. We all know that, and the electric vehicles and things like that. But what they're investing in tomorrow, and that will have an impact. So speaking of Taiwan, I hope that China will see that the costs of an invasion will be too high, that they will be rational actors in that way. What would frighten me, however, would be that if China would succeed in becoming so dominant in technologies that tomorrow's generation, maybe not 10 years down the line, but maybe 20 years down the line, say that which is most important, to save the world or to save democracy, i.e. Taiwan. And that really scares me. For me, that is one of the nightmare scenarios if China acquires a kind of soft power because it has access to and is part of the global solution rather than global challenge. And that frightens me because we do not have a solution for that. Otherwise, I'm relatively optimistic about both Japan and South Korea, absolutely the ASEAN countries. They have strong economies, they are innovative, but China is just so much bigger, even with the demographics, even with corruption, even with the irrationalities and Xi Jinping thought in medical school and so forth. Despite that, size does matter, as does quality and quantity. Thank you.
Thank you. Amrita, bringing it a little closer home to India. India has a neighborhood. We've seen a lot of flux in that neighborhood in Bangladesh and Nepal, Myanmar. We've tried to build an international sort of regional architecture there with SARC, which didn't really go very far because of difference between India, Pakistan, and now BIMSTEC, IORA. There are efforts being made to build institutions in South Asia. Where do you see the South Asian and Indian, the broader Indian neighborhood? Where do you see the regional architecture moving?
I think this government has tried to do quite a lot with neighborhood first. Maybe bilaterally relations will improve, but I find it difficult to be optimistic in terms of a South Asian regional architecture. There are too many differences between them with India. And there aren't enough synergies in terms of economic ones, right? And so I'm not hugely confident or optimistic that we will get much of a regional cooperation going. And India itself, in some ways, has almost transcended the region in terms of its power projection. Now, that's not an easy strategy. It's deeply problematic. It cannot transcend the region, but that's one of the ways in which it has been powerful globally.
You're saying it's not always good to try to transcend your region. The problem's closer to home. Karim, last but not least, perhaps the man of the hour, if you will, the Middle East. You're from Egypt. It's on everyone's mind. Many of our flights were disrupted because of tensions there. I know we can't even project out a week or 2 weeks, but where do you see maybe 10 years from now? What does the Middle East look like? Just an easy question.
That may be easier than finding a flight home. So I'm still waiting on a return ticket to see how I could get home back to Stockholm. So let me. So I don't know. I think that's the easy answer. But let me test a maybe proposition linking this question to the broader theme that we are discussing about global order. So the Middle East has been a center of contestation between great powers. So great powers have competed over influence in the Middle East. The Middle East contains still the largest reserve of energy in the form of oil and gas. The Middle East has transformed into a global financial hub. So the Middle East matters in terms of where world order is heading. But I put it to you, perhaps the biggest potential impact of what we are seeing in terms of the escalation of conflicts in the Middle East may be on the breakdown at the normative level. So it's at the Middle East where we truly see the breakdown in international law, in humanitarian frameworks, in conflict resolution processes to address what are becoming existential conflicts. And I think the easiest way to maybe visualize this dynamic is to think about how the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza played out side by side. So you see this, you have this split screen image of both conflicts playing out in real time simultaneously. And if we look at how these different frameworks are applied differently from one conflict to another, then I think it drives home the theme that we've been hearing here on a recurrent basis about the death of international law. And this was openly proclaimed by very high-level individuals such as Joseph Borrell. So even before the current war in Iran, where he referred to Gaza as the graveyard of international law. So this is where the breakdown of the normative framework is most acute. And I think that will have a profound impact on global order moving forward.
Thank you so much. We have, I see lots of hands up. That's always a good sign. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 4 of you and make it questions, comments, whatever, and then we can maybe circle back to the author. So let's start here in the front. Sorry. Yep. Yeah. Both. I was going to go to both of you. So yeah. We already have international negotiations underway.
Hello, thank you very much.
If you could also introduce yourself and where you're from for the benefit of the
My name is Ilya Tikhonov. I'm a Russian diplomat. I'm working in Foreign Policy Planning Department. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for making predictions, for sharing with us your vision, how the world might look like in 10 years. So it's always difficult to make predictions. It's also a sort of a game of mind, game of imagination. So what I would like to propose you is playing it in an opposite sense. So what do you think how the world might not look like in 2036?
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Gaute. I'm a Norwegian diplomat. So going a bit back and forth, I really like the game of looking 10 years ahead. And I want to throw in another region. So I wonder how you think the Arctic region will look like in 2036. How will the governance framework be like? Will there be increased tensions compared to today? And who will the most important stakeholders be? So I would love to hear both the Russian and also the Swedish perspective on this, and NATO and everyone.
The polar bears are important stakeholders there. Yes. And then.
Hello, thank you for sharing your insights with us. I'm Nadia from Iran. I have 2 questions. One of them is the general one. I want to ask you that is the world currently moving toward Mr. Trump's specific rules and drifting away from the international law? And a question more specific is about the transatlantic relations between America and Europe. Given that the US in its 2026 national security strategy refers to, I'm just quoting, restoring Europe's civilization, self-confidence, and Western identity, I just want to ask you, how do you assess these transatlantic relations? Thank you.
Thank you. And then, yes, over here. You've been very enthusiastic.
Right, you know the reason why I was enthusiastic because I've been ignored the whole time. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Chair. I have two quick questions. First of all, to Ms.
If you could introduce yourself as well.
Right. So this is Huang from Vietnam. To Ms. Nalika, so you talked about China and multilateralism, and you have also written about global governance. I was wondering, how do you see the so-called Big Four grand global initiative that China has been pushing, the global security and cultural and governance and what's the other one? Oh, development initiative that China have been pushing, and at the same time, China said that they are still championing multilateralism, UN-led order. So, do you see that those two kind of visions, they are contradictory, or they actually be complementary? And to wait, I forgot. To Mr. Dicken, my questions is: how do you see the trend of some of the Russians' historical partner, such as India and Vietnam, sort of diversifying away from buying arms from Russia? Does Russia see it as like a negative tendency or no? Thank you.
So I've got 5 questions. I'm going to direct each of those to one person here in the interest of time. So maybe start, Florence, on the transatlantic relationship piece, and then we can do Russia, and then Arctic. You had one on China's global initiatives, and maybe the very good question at the beginning, what will we not see at the end? That's it.
So two parts to that answer. First is, what I think with my NATO hat on, and then what I think as a European. Transatlantic relations from NATO, when you work in NATO, it's not as bad as the rest of the world thinks. As in, we have, there's a real tendency in the media, especially in Europe, only in Europe, to get almost hysterical the minute, one American doesn't show up to work, and like, okay, that means it's over. And it's not like that. Like inside, we have good cooperation, everything, that you hear in the news about, some changes in personnel structure, whatever, and even the assurances we get from our American partners are ironclad. So there is no debate. So yes, there is burden shifting, but if you know anything about history, and I'm afraid many people don't, then the issue of burden shifting started in NATO pretty much the day it was created. And it goes throughout NATO history. And even the people who think that this is the worst crisis ever, clearly I invite you to check out what the Nixon Doctrine is, or the 60s and so on. People forget that France left the military structure, etc. I mean, we're about to write an article on this. Like, there's an avalanche of literature. So now, actually, what I come to believe now is NATO is always in crisis, in the sense that NATO is a promise, and you don't know if that promise is actually going to be held up. So you're always going to be a bit jumpy about it, and that is what you feel in the media. So that is the NATO side of things. Since The Hague, finally, after 15 years, it started with Obama. Finally, the Europeans have understood, yeah, we need to spend more, we need to do more. And I frankly think you're not a good ally if you're not living up to your part of the deal. So this part is not controversial. Of course, the second part, and I think in the public, the two are often conflated. NATO, it's so much easier. I used to work in the EU. It's so much easier to work for NATO because we have only one job. It's defense. So prevent a war, and should it happen, win it. In the EU, or in the in Europe in general, it's much more about values and normative ideas about what the world should be and so forth. And of course, as a European, you read that and you think, why is that so important to American security, that we don't have migrants, or that, that we outlaw homosexuality or whatever? And that bit, I think, it says a lot more about how the MAGA movement conceives the future and creates certainty. And that's not just MAGA, you also have that in other parts, in certain parties in Europe. You deal with the uncertainty of the future by returning to the past. And that is something you see throughout history. Whenever the future becomes particularly uncertain, you see emerging movements, Make America Great Again, but plenty of others, that promise the future to be like the past, because there is no better, no safer future than the past, because you know exactly what it looks like. So I think it is just as the AfD, Rassemblement National, others that refer a lot to history to shape the future, it's an expression of unease with what's going on. So I would say it's much less an expression about how Americans feel about Europe, and much more an expression about how Americans feel about the future that lies ahead of them. So my invitation, or what I say on the news in Europe all the time, is stop obsessing about American policy. The only thing that really matters at the core is NATO, is security and defense. Everything else, yeah, it's a normative ideological debate you can have. It's just going to suck up a lot of energy.
Professor Dinkin, from our Vietnamese colleague, what does Russia think about India and Vietnam's diversification?
My first point is that the reliable country have to be self-sufficient in weaponry production. And according to this point, our arms sales to India always were combined with the technology transfer. So we are thinking about long-term India's security. Currently, we supply approximately 1/3 of the total India's import of weaponry. Not because there are no demand from our Indian partners, but mainly because there is a huge demand from Russian army currently. So we do understand that the country have to choose the price quality competition, and if somebody would find something more efficient than S-400 Triumph, God bless, I'm not quite sure that this is possible.
Hans Christian, on the Arctic?
Yes, but first I'd like to answer the question which you didn't ask me. I do think that it is really important that no major power today has said they do not believe in international law, that they do not believe in universal human rights, they do not believe in the UN Charter. What says there, what we all have agreed to, in my view, is still valid until you really physically have left the building and stopped paying the bills and started to sabotage for everything else. And as long as there is a slither of hope, and that will continue, but for most countries in the world, these are highly relevant and valuable and important, and we still believe what we signed once upon a time. Getting back to the Arctic, I'm quite comfortable with having very much of the Arctic in the hands of the Norwegians, of the Danes, and the Canadians. And very much of the Arctic is about climate change. It is about indigenous populations. It is about natural resources, fishing rights, and things like that. There's a lot of hype around the Northeastern Passage. But I think the further away we are from the Arctic, the more dramatic and interesting it is. Last year, there were 103 transits through the Northeastern route. There are 300 transits a day through the Malacca Sound. And in the Arctic, it's 103 per year. It's a very short season. It's 4.5 months long. And to build an ice-class ship is twice as expensive building a non-ice-class ship because it's more metal. And it costs about 50% more to propel. So therefore, unless you have way better conditions for trade, it's just, there's no economy there today. There may be in the very long term, but if you ask the shipping companies or you ask the mining companies, it's really bad weather, it's really expensive. There's a reason why China or Russia has not been investing in Greenland, nor has the US or anybody else, because it's really expensive, it's really cold, it's lousy weather, and God bless the Danes, but we should be grateful that they are taking care of Greenland, but we should not be afraid that China has invaded or taking all the resources. The North is the North.
So yeah, please.
And I have not included Russia in this, I apologize, but.
Look, I guess that the Arctic and Northern Pass received one more dimension recently, and this dimension is the freedom and security of maritime navigation. We look at the Hormuz Strait, we look at the Malacca, which is not very wide. So in this sense, the role of the Arctic would depend very much.
And could I just say that Russia could do, if I may be a bit confrontational, more. Russia does take quite a high fee for search and rescue and using of the lighthouses and so forth. So there are obstacles to this. So it needs to be a lot cheaper and better weather for it to be economically viable. It is not today. So God bless Norway.
Amrita, on the question on China's, global security initiative and other initiatives.
Sure, thanks for that question. the global initiatives are not per se in challenging multilateralism. There have always been alternative initiatives, right? And developing countries, the global south, have often worked independently, sort of within the system, but come up with different types of ideas, the new international economic order, G77, special and differential treatment within the WTO. These are, and it's not just developing countries, right? In a system of multilateralism, we've always had Article 24, which has allowed regional trade agreements, and that, so there have always been these sort of inconsistencies, and the system has worked nonetheless. Where it does become, your question's a great one, because where it could become a problem is this. Right now, multilateralism is really not doing very well. It's, across the different organizations, whereas China is offering an alternative that could work, right? And that's where it becomes problematic if you're an old-fashioned multilateralist, right? Because here's an alternative, and we have to get multilateralism and an updated, reformed way to work. Otherwise, China is doing a better job than we are, right? And that's serious. That's a problem. And if I might add very briefly to the transatlantic question to the lady from Iran, I would say, to me, the relationship is not looking that great, the transatlantic relationship, in comparison to, say, even 2022, when I was in a setting in Germany and I was told, no, this is the most important relationship. This is the priority. Now, and that's where the values part does get interesting. And I think we should go out and, shake Mr. Trump's hand and say, thank you very much, because we might not have, the EU-India trade agreement. I know there are a lot of negotiators who've been working very hard on this, but were the system under not so much pressure, and were the transatlantic relationship not under so much pressure, I don't think the Indians or the EU would have made some of the compromises that they did. And it's not just a trade agreement, right? It's also like the security element to it, and the foreign policy element to it, right? And that, yes, if the transatlantic partnership were completely hunky-dory, we would not get that agreement.
15 years ago, the EU-India trade negotiations were like a war, a battle. I have scar tissue from it. And Trump, thanks to Trump, we actually have it. So Trump should get the Nobel Peace Prize for that, if nothing else. Karim, a really good question again. What do you see not happening in 10 years from now? What kind of international order can we rule out?
So the very good question by our Russian friend here. Forgive me, I forget your name. Ilyan. So Ilyan, first of all, I appreciate you thanking us for all of these interesting predictions. I think we all avoided making predictions, but thank you anyway. So I will attempt an answer at your very important question, but I can't resist commenting on what I thought was a very pertinent comment by Hans. So Hans, you said that there is no government or head of state that has declared that they are not bound by international law. I think that's true until 4 weeks ago. And where there was one head of state who openly declared that he is not bound by any international law. Now, I realize that is symbolic, right? That the president of the United States says interesting things every once in a while, and it may not reflect the formal position of the administration. I understand. I don't mean to be facetious, but it was highly symbolic about the overall outlook and approach of this administration when it comes to open order. And certainly when it comes to the question of global order, there the United States has been very emphatic in saying that they are no longer bound by any of these pillars that I mentioned regarding global order. And that, I think, is much more than symbolic. So that maybe gets to Ilyan's question about what will the future of the order not look like. And here I think I will say an easy answer and then maybe say something more interesting. The easy answer is it will not look like what it looks like today. The drivers of change are too profound. They are accelerating at a pace whereby policy is unable to keep up with changes in institutional erosion with changes in technology, with the pace of technological change and so on. And so what could it look like? And here I think it gets us to the very interesting title of this panel, Back to the Future. And here the future may look like the past. So it may look like previous versions of international order. So it may look like the international order which prevailed during the interwar years, where we had an institutional structure. It was called the League of Nations. It proved to be quite marginal and irrelevant. So if the current trajectory of the erosion of multilateralism today continues, we may have a United Nations that is irrelevant. It may still be there, but marginal when it comes to global politics. Or we can go back to an order that prevailed prior to World War I. So some form of concert of states that attempted to impose a certain balance of power until it broke down. Again, with the pace of technological change, with the pace of industrial development, with the rise in nationalist sentiments that produced ultimately the First World War. So it depends on how you answer the overall title of this panel, Back to the Future. And it may be the current order is an aberration. So historians can tell us that this may be the exception, not the rule. So I hope that was interesting enough to counter my very boring answer to you, which was, I just simply don't know what it will look like.
Yeah, so I just had an insight. Because, so when I was in Davos, I heard a presentation on the Global Cooperation Barometer that I invite you to Google. It's a cooperation of the World Economic Forum and McKinsey, and it measures, as the name indicates, global cooperation on 5 indices. Unfortunately, I can't remember one of them, but tech, health and science, trade, and conflict and diplomacy. And contrary to what, we're in the defense bubble, so obviously we care most about the area where it's really not going well. But in all the other areas, cooperation has gone up. Even trade has become more regionalized, but you had in 2025 an increase in trade agreements in the world, despite, the trade wars declared by the White House and so forth. The same goes for scientific cooperation. The same goes for tech cooperation. So if you want to make yourself feel better, maybe Google that report, because I think we're not doing ourselves a service by recreating artificially a Cold War world where, we're all living in these blocks. We are in the 21st century. So yes, we don't have good relations with Russia, for instance, but that doesn't mean that information can be stopped. It doesn't mean that trade can be stopped. It doesn't mean that cooperation in many other areas can be stopped. So what I think when I think of the future is you have to be capable of being frenemies. You do not cooperate on some things, but you cooperate on other things because you have to.
Yes, just a little bit on what Karim's saying, that we have a tendency to be very state-focused, but do not forget that there are other players as well, not just states and institutions, both regional and global, but also cities, corporations, philanthropists, interest groups, political movements, others who are players as well, and they may become more important in the future. Now, this is really going back to the future because, speaking of the East India Company and others, there are examples of corporations that have had huge impacts way beyond other countries and so forth. So we're a bit stuck in the traditional of its United States, China, India, EU, NATO, the traditional good old guys. And I think we need to be open that things can and will change or go back.
Professor Dinkin, sorry, pass the mic, please.
Sure. Okay. I believe that Karim mentioned the concept of nation, which was set up after the Napoleon Wars, and he compared it with the current situation. I guess that this concept of nation have one advantage, because all 5 countries who used to be the guarantees of this world order, they have similar political structure. All of them were monarchy. We do not see it today. And another story is that I guess that the next world order would not be set up in Europe. It would be set at best in Eurasia with United States participation. This makes different about the future world order. If you ask me how looks the world order in 2026, during recent 4 weeks, I would say that we find ourselves in more unipolar world order than it was in 2025. And if you would ask me to label this world order, I would say that this is no rule power-based world order.
Let's do another round of questions and comments. So maybe we'll start. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hands up. So we'll start here, and I'll try and get to all of you. Yep, even in the back, but let's start in the front.
Thank you. My name is Valerie. I'm Austrian Canadian and work for the Munich Security Conference. And my question is on another region that we haven't yet touched upon, space. If any of you would like to comment, what you think, how control of space will reshape the future global order.
Thank you. The gentleman over here on the first table.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Aaron Pinto. I'm with the Canadian Consulate in New York. In today's world, narrative control and information influence can shape geopolitical outcomes as much as military power. And I'm curious, are we entering a period where legitimacy itself is used as a strategic weapon? Thank you.
Sorry, could you just, I mean, that's broad. Can you give an example of legitimacy being used as a weapon?
That's nothing off the top of my head, but I defer to you.
We had two questions, 2 hands up here. Yep. Sorry.
Hey, my name is Anna-Stina. I come from Finland, and my question would be explicitly to Mr. Dinkin. Could you please reflect on whether Russia sees itself more as a catalyst for change of world events, or more as a reactionary power, since on one hand, maybe one of the narratives with which you explain the Ukraine war with is as a reaction to EU's action. And on the other hand, you still consider to be yourselves to be a superpower. And now that the strongman rule is also like trending, is that changing this somehow? Thank you.
I think the gentleman next to you. Oh, no.
Trying to get your attention, but
Oh, I see. And then behind, I'm sorry, the table behind, and then we have 2 over here, and then we'll wrap after.
hello, my name is Ivan. I live in Estonia. My question is also for Alexander Dinkin. If I understood your assessment for Central Asia for 2036, is that the region will have success and success. I was just wondering about your assessment on the role of what has been called multi-vector foreign policy, and how that contributes, how you consider, what role does that play in your assessment about the success for the Central Asian region?
Sorry, who's multi-vector foreign policy?
Of the countries of Central Asia.
Of the Central Asians. Yeah. We have 2 hands up here. 2 hands up on the left.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Gonzalo Báñez from Argentina, journalist from Argentina. I think that if we talk about future, we have to talk about digitalization and social medias. So I would like to hear the perspective from India, Europe, and as well as Russia, if any regulation is needed for the future in social media. Thank you.
Social media regulation. Okay. And last question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Chaula and I'm from Indonesia. My question will be on the current development in Japan, particularly with the new prime minister. Would you think that the intention of Japan, is it a rearmament, or is it a historical ambition, or is it just a normal response to what's going on in the world? And how would Japan's current development, or maybe in trying to rearm itself, will change the future of the global order? Thank you.
Was that directed at any one person in particular, or anyone?
To anyone.
Okay. Okay. So I think we had 2 questions directed specifically to Professor Dinkin, and then I think I'll just go around after. So maybe he can take those 2, and then I can go down and ask anyone to answer any questions that they would like to answer. So the first one was on Russia as a catalyst or reactive force in international politics, and the second was on Central Asia's multi-vector foreign policy.
Well, I would say that Russia is both. And, I already mentioned this point that the demise of empires never goes smoothly. If you look at relations between India and Pakistan, you find out that this confrontation problems lives for completely 80 years. So this is the case of Russia, and we tried to solve the matter starting from, let's say, Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, when he explained that Russia is back on the international scene and you have to pay attention to Russia's national interest. That was simple message, which was
This was 2007. Right?
2007, and this message was read completely different. Definitely, Russia is a superpower if we have the sustainable strategic balance with United States, and we substantially surpass China in the strategic forces. So Russia has a great culture, and those former independent states from Soviet Union who have long-lasting cultures, such as, say, Uzbeks or Armenians, Georgians. They do not have any Russophobic, let's say, intentions inside those countries. So the culture is very much matter, and I guess also in those dimensions, Russia is a superpower. Regarding Central Asia, they are independent states, and we do not have any substantial request to them, just the basics of international order, not to join the unfriendly organization and not to implement sanctions against Russia. If you avoid all these 2 points, you could do whatever you want.
Okay. For the other questions, I'm going to just recap them, and then maybe we'll do it in the reverse order. So maybe start with Karim and go down this way. That gives you a little bit of time. Yeah, you get the last word. Just to recap, we had a question on space, and what does that look like? On legitimacy being weaponized, on social media regulation, and on Japan's rearmament. So feel free to take a crack at any of those.
Okay, let me try and address maybe the first two of these questions. So on the weaponization of information, so yes, this is one area of contestation where narratives are weaponized, and that gets to sort of these very big themes that we hear dominating much of the discussion of how emerging technologies will influence the propagation and even the formulation of these narratives. Right? So artificial intelligence actually formulating narratives of its own in a way in which we can lose control of these narratives. But I think it gets to a broader dynamic which we didn't have time to touch on, which is the weaponization of everything. So weaponization of the dollar, weaponization of the banking system, weaponization of critical technologies, of supply chains, and so on. And that dynamic can coexist with the dynamic that Florence mentioned of cooperation. So yes, these things can coincide, side by side, precisely because of the compartmentalization that you mentioned. But this is a rising dynamic in which these vectors of cooperation can proceed alongside with the very intensive weaponization that we're seeing. Maybe that relates to space. So space is a very interesting question because it touches on a new domain of the global commons, which is contested. And like previous new domains, so like the maritime domain, for example, it depends whether that is contested through rules of the game, so a regime for outer space, or without any rules. So we have an outer space treaty that bans the deployment of nuclear weapons in outer space. But other than that, there is a very thin veneer of law that governs space. So it depends how we contest this new global commons. Similarly, with the information space, we have no agreed upon framework for governing cyberspace. I mean, do the rules, does international law apply in cyberspace? Does international humanitarian law, so the laws of war, do these apply in these new domains. So that will very much depend on how we contest this new domain.
Let me follow up with a little bit more on the narratives question. A couple of points. So the first one is, we've started paying much more attention to the question of how narratives can be weaponized in the context of AI, like you said, and social media, like one of the other people here also raised this point. But narratives have mattered for a long time, and we've just not paid enough attention to them, right? And I'll give you just one example of this. Trump 1.0, right? And the very strong anti-trade narrative that was a part of the election campaign, and it was successful. Think of Brexit, right? Also a very strong narrative on why being a part of the EU is problematic. Now, a lot of those stories turned out to be factually wrong, right? There was the counter narrative of Remain. There was a free trade narrative, right? Coming from the multilateral organizations, coming from certain quarters within the EU, but it was a really boring narrative. These were very boring narratives with no appeal, right? And I went to the WTO and I said, look, why don't you engage more with people, right? And the answer was, well, because we're a technical organization, we're not a PR company. But that's not PR, right? You need to be able to explain to people this is what trade does for you, and it's a good thing, right? Back in the day before we were getting into the whole security trade linkage. So we were already losing that war, right, on trade issues. Now, in the context of AI, right? Here, I just wanted, we've not had much time to talk about this yet. So I just want to raise one point, just sort of food for thought. Right? We're all talking about AI in terms of how the dangers of AI, right? The problems associated with AI. And that's true, right? There are very serious risks associated with AI, but I was speaking with an AI expert yesterday here at Raisina Dialogue, and it depends on what we make of AI, right? It depends on the information that we're feeding in, right? So we could get an AI that could help in the building of a world that is much kinder, that is able to bring in voices that are not heard yet, if we program it in that way, if we do the coding in that way, right? And then, of course, who's going to do that, right? You need to have interests to do this, institutions to do this, some of the issues that all my co-panelists were talking about. But we could think more imaginatively about AI, and that would also impact upon the narratives that AI could come up with. Because right now, I agree with you. Now, there are real dangers, but let's think about making AI, constructing AI in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may start off with space. 10 years ago, the Chinese doctrine was to deprive the United States of the domain of space in times of war. Things have changed, and Chinese strategy is much more opaque today, but everything points to massive investments in space from China. So that I really do agree that it is truly contentious, and will become even more contentious in the future. But do not forget that China also has, apart from air, sea, land, which we all have, and everybody has cyber, everybody has space as domains of warfare, they also have the cognitive domain of warfare and the biological domain of warfare. We can't even spell those domains. On the issue of Takeichi, I'm very, very comfortable with Japan and Japan's rearmament. Japan, together with South Korea and Taiwan, are the only full democracies in East Asia. They are super predictable. However, Japan is struck by high debt, low growth, negative demographics, but it is a rich and super developed society. So I'm quite confident that they will rearm in a very credible and trustworthy and transparent way. They are not looking for mistakes or misinterpretations or being misunderstood in any shape or form. So I'm very comfortable with Japan. Thank you.
Just to any of the other questions, Dr. Dinkin, do you have any? Do you have any response to any of the other questions?
Well, I
apart from
guess
the ones-
it's a very important issue that weaponizing of narratives, because it's rather dangerous. And as some of us remember, according to New Testament, the word was at the beginning. So I am not quite sure that our audience remembered the Paris Charter, which was signed in 1990, which declares a very positive and nice stories that they say that the era of confrontation is over and Europe is freeing itself from the legacy of the past. Looking back 20, 30 something years, it looks like astonishing naivety from one hand and the stunning cynicism from the other hand. And afterwards, this idea of end of history were basis for the strategic planning. And we see the Arab Spring, the NATO expansion, and even Ukrainian crisis. It goes out of this false narrative. And if you look at the speech of Mr. Marco Rubio at the recent Munich Security Conference, he called this narrative a foolish idea. And I share this view.
Florence, last word.
Last word. Well, since I think all the questions have been answered, I'm just going to freestyle. But actually, thank you for building a bridge to something I wanted to mention anyway, because I think, the title of this panel is Back to the Future. So really, it's about the future. What is the future is actually not what's going to happen. It's the stories we tell ourselves about what's going to happen. And I think the problem that we have in Europe, remember when I said I went to a science fiction convention, Europeans, precisely for the reasons that you just mentioned, stopped. You can even track it. Like in the German parliament, the future disappears from the debates around the early 2000s. Number of reasons, financial crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for a number of reasons, the West, if you want, stopped having a positive vision for what the future is, because the future was there. The positive future had been achieved in 1990. And from then on, it was tomorrow is going to be the same as today. Now, the problem is, if you don't have a vision for the future, it's like an airplane that goes into glide mode, it will descend eventually. And you're going to be outcompeted by people that have a vision for the future. And so we did a study on this. The country in the world that at the moment has, as a collective, the most compelling vision for the future is China. Of course, you have islands, of strong futures, as I mentioned, in Africa, but you do not have it in Europe. You also don't have it in Russia. You don't have it in the United States. So in the marketplace that the future is, Europeans, I am Europeans, I'm going to say Europeans, one of the real issues that they have it now is formulate a compelling vision for the future, because otherwise you're going to be outcompeted by others.
Thank you. I think we didn't get to the question on social media. I'm sure there are other sessions that will address that. It was a very good question, but I think beyond the scope of this, but just to add a quick note on Japan's rearmament, I think it's just something I've sort of tracked for a long time. But I think you have to just think of the historical legacy. Hans Christian, suggested sort of some aspects of it. I would just add a few more. Japan did not have a defense ministry until 2006. And so it's after Abe's election and then re-election that a lot of things moved between 2006 and 2015 that we now see as a sort of normalization of Japan's military force. You had National Security Council set up, a national security strategy, and some of the basic things that large states take for granted. A few questions, though, I think going forward on Japan's rearmament. Society is still very pacifist. This is shown out in polls. Japanese, military officers or special SDF, self-defense force officers, take off their uniforms when they go in public transportation. That shows that there's still quite a lot of antipathy to the military. They're just figuring out some military classified systems, which seems, sort of something that, again, a lot of countries have in place. It's actually impeded cooperation with the United States, even with NATO, I believe, in certain areas because of this issue of classified classification. And Japan also doesn't have a long history of defense exports. It's only now, there'll be some sales now to Australia, some vessels to Vietnam, but it's really just getting in the game of defense exports because of this long pacifist orientation. So there's still many question marks, I think, associated with the rearmament, even though it will almost certainly be accompanied by a big budgetary increase. Sorry, with that tangent, please thank the excellent speakers for a very innovative and wide-ranging discussion.